Okay, I guess one of the things I know you've got a lot of extra free time, so, but I will give you a solution for the rest of this problem. If you look at it, I bring in the idea of a cost model and then a profit model, etc. But we've got to get through enough here tonight so that you're comfortable with the lesson 6. So why don't you turn to page 159, page 159. And so if you read below the word regression there, currently regression is one of the most powerful techniques used to create models of reality. Just a few years ago, it was the most powerful of reality. And so this again is why these large corporations, the Amazons, etc., why they go off and recruit theoretical mathematicians and theoretical physicists, because they are good at writing math equations, creating models. And the theoretical mathematician may have studied some new concepts in mathematics. And if you remember, I said mathematics is the study of patterns. And so there's a lot of different ways to try to identify a pattern in data. And so what that does is it affects the second step there. If you look up at the top, the word first was left out. So where it says, it should read first, create the dots, the facts, the data, using the 5 phases of metric design. Because of time constraints, I'm not going to do that with this problem. If we have some time, I'll go through it quickly when we meet next Friday, whenever we meet, and I'll go through that again. We're going to assume that we have valid data. And so you might put up there, under the first is, you're thinking like an empiricist. The empiricist said the only way we can acquire knowledge about the natural world is to go off and sense the world, measure it. But just being able to sense the natural world and having all these facts does not mean that you've seen any pattern in it. And so the ability to try and flesh out whether there are patterns in this data is what regression analysis does, or other types of mathematical reasoning. So the second step is think like a rationalist. Make sense of what you have sensed, connect the dots using mathematical and statistical reasoning. So tonight we're going to look at linear regression, which is the simplest type of mathematics. And so if you remember last time we met, we did the problem that's on the next page, and we talked about interpreting the slope and the y-intercept. Remember I said that one, there's a 100% chance that you're going to have a question on the closed book. Talk to me about the slope, talk to me about the y-intercept. If you're not comfortable with that, please make an appointment and see me and we'll go over it. So then it would be down at the bottom 160, it says creating a model of reality using inductive reasoning. Problem. And we go to page 161. Assume you are hired by a company that does tree removals. We want you to create a costing model that will aid them in projecting what it will cost to remove a tree. You are only concerned with the costing, not the pricing. Now, why will people say costing is much easier to do than pricing models? Yeah. generally the argument is you have control of your production system. You don't have perfect control, but you have control. When you get in, that's called a closed system. And we will talk about this issue more, that early in the game, part of what you have to do is you have to identify the forces that impact your goal. That's your phase 3, remember? What are you going to measure? And so let's at least look at this. Now the goal is cost, you follow me? So look at phase 3 down there on page 161. Now on the final, I want you to write this out when I ask you to talk to me about phase 3. Write out what to measure. My goal is impacted by force 1, force 2, ... But then for your specific problem, for this particular problem, you would replace the goal with my cost of removing a tree depends on, is impacted by is a function of, these words all mean the same thing. And force 1. This is your responsibility. This is your thinking about. You are managing something that has some goals. If you are to manage it intelligently, what do you have to know? What are the forces that impact it? And so if you bring me in, I'm going to look at you and say, I don't know your business. You got to tell me what are the forces that you think are important. This again is why Bill Gates says, who's going to lead us into the knowledge revolution? The mind mappers. Because what are they going to do? They're going to be far more creative in what they figure out should be measured. Okay? And so I might look at this and say, you know, tree height. How tall is the tree? Tree diameter. Distance to power lines, buildings, distance to us. Does that make sense? A lot of times the biggest cost is getting the crew out there. If they're an hour out or something, you've got 2 hours of travel time, etc. Insurance cost, fuel cost, equipment cost, type of tree. You follow me on that? So in a real life problem, if you were starting out, you would probably go back and say, we are going to run a study. And we are going to keep track of the cost accountant will do what? They'll tell us what the costs were that were costed out against that tree. You follow me? And then we will say, we want to know what the height of the tree was. We want to know the diameter, how far it was from power lines. You follow me? We just go down the line here. Did you see that all fits into a spreadsheet very nicely? And this is what the idea of the big data is. We go off and we do this. Now, the one that we would look at and say, oops, that creates some problems. Type of tree. You see an oak tree is certainly going to cost more than a birch tree to cut down. But that's qualitative data. It means that that's describing it with a word. Regression needs everything to be quantitative. But there's things called neural nets. And we'll talk a little bit about neural nets. You'll be reading something about these. They've been around for 50, 60 years. But this is one of the hot topics now in big data. 20 years ago, I used software where I would we'd do a multiple regression problem, and we would do it to project what the stock market was going to do. And then we would do it with a neural net. But one of the good things about neural nets was you can use verbal data. You can use qualitative data in it. But it is really the same as it's using inductive reasoning. The two steps are still the same. And so with a neural net, you basically say to the computer, you say, I want to be able to correctly, the example we used actually was in real estate. I want to be able to project with 95% confidence what the actual selling price of this home will be within $5,000 of the selling price. Everybody follow me? Then what you do, and neural nets are data intensive. That's why the idea of big data. So let's say you're a larger company and you've got 50,000 homes you've sold. Rule of thumb is you take about 75% of the data, you randomly pick it up and you say, here's the data on 37,500. I should have picked an easier number. 37,500 homes. And you basically said, here's the selling price, what they sold for. Here are the forces, you follow me? Square footage, age, distance to a lake, style of the home, etc. You lay all that out, and then it says, how confident do you want to be? 95% confident. Within what level of error? $5,000. And then you push a couple buttons, and the computer then will come back and you hope say, I think I've learned. I think I can do this for you. And it's called black box or machine learning. And people can't come back and say, well, let me explain to you how this works. Well, you're going to read about this with the idea of machine learning versus human learning. And yet the thing that I want you to understand is it's the same dang two steps. You have to have data that you put in that has some integrity, because if the data is all screwed up, the model is going to be all screwed up. The model describes what you're claiming is reality. That means you have valid data. And then it does crazy math. Now we're going to do a little bit of crazy math here, okay? But I can explain to you how that math kind of works. You follow me? But you get into the machine learning and you got to just say, so then how do you test it? That's why you only use 75% of your data. Because then you take the other 12,500 numbers and you say, here are square footage, make a prediction. And what do? You check it, you test it, and you say, what was the prediction? How many times did it correctly capture? You see you had that 5,000. And it comes back in the 95 area. You say, we're in good shape. But then you as a manager, what is it that you got to keep constantly talking to yourself about? What? Absolutely, because you have to look at it and you have to say to yourself, the word that is used in systems work, have there been any events that have changed the status of the system? So suddenly, well, the housing market collapsed. So when I taught this course in 2008, I'd say none of these models I would use. I wouldn't use any of these models. We haven't a clue what is going on. And if you listen to, I think it was Bernanke at that time, the econometrics is multiple regression, using lots of pieces of information to predict how things will go. He says we're flying blind right now. We've never been in this situation where the prime interest rate is where it's at. So we don't know how the market is going to behave. And what did Bush came out, and it was absolutely the right thing to say. If you want to do what's right for the country, get out there and buy. Don't panic and start saving. So that was great information. I think he should have said to the companies was what? Don't panic and fire people, hire people. So that there's more. But they didn't. They didn't. And a lot of companies did lay off when they went through the soft. And so their concern there was that what was going to happen was that the public would react the way the Japanese did. And so the Japanese they were savers in the first place. They went crazy on saving. And you see that caused they didn't have enough people buying. And so again, the article that I passed out to you, or showed you from MIT on the way the wages went, that's the concern of the economists, is to have a healthy, growing economy. What do you have to have? People will have money who can buy stuff. And the numbers and the theories say the people at the top who are filthy rich, they aren't buying the everyday things that cause the economy to really grow.
Is the statistical definition of valid data that it's accurate, precise, and reliable?
That's just phase 5. It is all 5 phases were done correctly. That's why you did this. You measured the right thing. Remember that example we talked about with people looking at hit rates on their website. They did a lot of things right, but they didn't measure whether people were buying anything. So to me, it's a useless study. It doesn't tell me what it is for a manager. It tells me nothing about revenue cost.
So it wasn't valid.
It wasn't valid. As long as one of them is really off, you're never going to be perfect. Well-designed studies right at the beginning. Not as I'll put it in an appendix and it'll say, we do have some reservations on the 5 phases or whatever terminology they use. You can see those. You follow me? Any good research should have that. And then there are these assumptions. Well, phase 2 is just all assumptions. There's nothing that tells you the future is going to resemble the past. Have you made some intelligent assumptions there? Have you thought about what competition is doing? Do you have any idea of technological breakthroughs that are coming through? Do you have any idea of reasons why consumer confidence might tank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so we're going to come back and keep it as simple as possible. And I'm going to say, well, we're going to measure cost, and we're going to see if we can't get by with just one piece of data. You follow me? And that's always the way you do modeling. Einstein said, look for simplicity in your models, but don't be too simple.
Tom, is the analysis you can do when you weight each different factor, each different egg accessible to a force, but then there's also analysis you can do combine the different x's of the forces as well. So if you say if you have x1 and x3, they're more powerful than if x2 and x3 exist. What does that called when you start to look at the combination of different x's and the impact of that based on both y or role?
Well, one of the things would be that you'd look at what's called a coefficient of determination. And that's trying to measure how much of the variation in Y can be explained by the X. Okay. And then you get into some things called confounding and other things that get way beyond what we can talk about. And so I'd say it's a good question, but at this point, yeah, it's beyond what we can do in a short time. Okay. So what we're going to assume here is that this is valid data. And we have a tree that was 1 foot in diameter, and it cost us $400 to cut it down. Everybody follow me? There was a tree that was 2 foot in diameter. It cost us $300. Now, if you were starting out, why might you say darn here? Because you believe there should be a positive relationship here. That as X gets bigger, what are you expecting of the cost? It should go up. But I look at Laura and I say, Laura says, don't worry about it. Y is a. That's right. And you got a little unlucky here. Not all 2 foot diameter trees are going to cost the same. They're going to vary. And suddenly we're working with a random variable. And so we're into a probabilistic model, and we have to approach it differently. We're going to get through part of this tonight. So if we look at this, this is called a scattergram. Now, the word regression is a terrible word. It tells us nothing about the mathematics that's being used. And so it would have been better to just say linear regression. Is a technique that fits a straight line to the data pattern. And if you are talking about polynomial regression, it's a curved line. We will just look at fitting straight lines. But you can fit a curved line to the data pattern. Or it is probably better to call it the least squares technique. I think it was in the 1830s that Gauss comes up with this idea. Now, it goes about 100 years when a group of medical doctors used it, and they were using it to try and predict what a son's adult height would be. What their goal was, these doctors worked with children that were either growing too quickly or growing too slowly. And they were trying to identify, should we be trying to reduce the rate at which the child is growing? And so can we predict how tall they're should be growing to? And what was the piece of information that they looked at? The father's adult height. And you see that's pretty easy. They can go back and look at a father and an adult son or sons, and you have all kinds of data. And when they did the regression analysis, which is what we're going to do tonight, they basically said it isn't perfect, but this line describes kind of the general trend. And so this is, and they added the little hat. This was the estimated son's adult height. And this was the equation that they used. But then they came back and they said, but this pattern does not continue to be linear, because shorter fathers don't have sons that are shorter than they are. It isn't a 50-50. Do you follow me? If it was, you see people would have kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Taller fathers don't have taller sons. Occasionally they do, but it isn't 50-50. What a regression assumes is that we're going along here, and if we're using a linear equation here, half the y values are going to be above the line and half are going to be below. Okay? And so unfortunately, this technique had never been used, and the two medical doctors said, and in this area, the heights of the son regress to the average. The heights of the sun regress to the average. The editor fell in love with the word regress, and so he called it regression analysis. And it has nothing to do with, remember I'm studying regression analysis. When the hell is somebody going to tell me where this comes from? And so I had a guy that he had the most used advanced book in regression analysis. He was the teacher, and so I went up to him, and that's the story he told. So don't keep looking at the word regress. Regress means that you go backwards in your behavior and you cry and you pout. That's what's happened when you study this shit. You start pouting and saying, why do I have to do this shit, etc. Okay, so what I would like you to do is to turn to page 163. And do you see it says your cost model? Now, obviously, this is not a straight line. So what I'd like you to do on page 163, draw a straight line that you think best describes this pattern. And make sure it comes over and crosses the y-intercept. Everybody follow me? Just draw a straight line. And I'm going to ask you to do some arithmetic on that, so draw that in. Everybody got something? Okay. If you turn the page to page 164, notice it says Tom's cost model. So I'm going to look at this and I'm going to say, I'm going to draw the line And so my line goes through these 2 points and it goes through the 3. Okay? So all we're going to do here is approximate. So if you look at my line, you see my y-intercept is a is equal to 3. So for yours, let's say you had something that looked like this. Your line, you follow me? So for your line, just approximate, I'll say this is 1.9. Now for my line, I might look at this and say, start at the y-intercept and just change x by 1. And then I go up, and my change in y, I ended up with y being 4. I started at 3. So my slope would be change in y over change in x, 1 over 1 or 1. So my model would be y hat equals 1x plus 3. Then there's a little addendum that you always add to your regression equations, and I write that my x values have to be values that are between 1 and 5.
Why is that?
Yeah. Regression describes our experiences. That's all I have the data for. So this is called, this is the model's range of relevancy. And this is where, again, the mathematician and the statistician didn't make it easy on you, because the mathematician will call this the domain. Depending on how much math you remember, the domain was all the x values that you should use. The y values were the range. And so then when they use the word range there, it can throw you off. But this is what is accepted. So you come over here on this one, and if you do it, you come over and you say, well, change in x is 1, and maybe I come up here and I come across, and change in y is 3 minus 1.9, 1.1. What I'm looking for is the idea that I'm guessing that your equation will be different than my equation. You follow me? How I fit the line. So get your equation then. And so I'll write mine here, and this is y hat Anybody proud of their equation? Dan, do you have a good equation?
No.
Amanda?
Mine was the same as yours.
Nora or somebody? Carl? Angie? I think none of you did this shit, but Stephen? Anybody else? Well, I'll use this one then. The one I erased. So y hat equals 1.x plus 1.9. Okay? And we'll call that Ralph's. Okay? So here's Gauss's thinking, and it's very good thinking. He looks at it, he says, there's an infinite number of straight lines we could draw through here. You follow me? We could position that any way we want. Who has the best cost model? So, basic question. Who has the best cost model? And what he says is, to answer this, we must define the word best such that it can be measured quantitatively. We want to get away from saying, well, mine looks better, mine is closer. We want to talk actual numbers. And so anytime you have a model that makes predictions, how do you assess whether it's any good? Did it predict what happened? And this is one of the things I think maybe we talked a little bit, that the woman that headed IBM's moving into being a consultant type company, helping you create models of reality. And so there's certainly Watson out there. And Watson, in a lot of ways, to me, is like having another consultant. It isn't somebody that you would trust for everything, but you would hope that they could provide, Watson could provide you with some information or things that you haven't thought about. And then it gets into more sophisticated work, because if it's providing information, information has no meaning. You got to bring the meaning. The next step is that Watson is starting to explain to you why these things work. But she said the thing that was just amazing was the number of times, and he said, these were huge Fortune 500 companies. And we'd say, well, how do you evaluate whether your models that you use for predicting are any good? And she said, at least half of them would look at you like, what are you talking about? I was like, well, don't you go back and look at what you predicted what would happen versus what actually happened? I was like, no, we're in the doing mode, do you follow me? And so how do you determine what kind of biases you have? You follow me? What kind of errors are you making? And so here's the way Gauss defined this. He said what we have to look at is, and this would have been the verbal explanation, we need the error in estimating cost, and that will equal the actual cost minus the estimated cost. And hopefully you look at that and say, oh yeah, that seems rather commonsensical. If I want to look at it symbolically, I say my error in estimating is equal to y minus y hat. Now, in this case, you see, we're looking at actual dollars difference that we'd have. And so this is, we'll talk about, I'll just say, next time we meet, we'll look at something called a bias. And the bias would be the actual divided by the estimated. And this number can be greater than 1, equal to 1, or less than 1. This number can be greater than 0, equal to 0, or less than 0. There are only two ways to compare numbers. You either subtract them or you divide them. That's how you compare two numbers. And we'll try and talk a little bit about financial models. When you do this in finance, you're looking at rates of returns. When you do this in finance, you're looking at cash flow, actual dollars that you're. So he then came along and said, well, the way we're going to determine what's his best is each of us will be given just one piece of information, the tree's diameter. Now, see, if x is 1, I would have said it's going to cost $400, 1 plus 3. David would have said it's going to cost 3. And Ralph would have said it's going to cost 3. Everybody follow me? X is 1, 1.1 times 1 plus 1.9 is 3, etc. And so why do we say, well, let's just use these numbers then? We don't have to wait around and do 5 new jobs or something. Let's just use these 5. And what we're going to do is we'll calculate summation E for 5 jobs. Smallest summation E is the best. That makes sense? The model that has the smallest total errors in estimating would be viewed as the best model. We're just adding up the errors. E. Summation E here. So let me quickly, you can just kind of look at this and instead of doing it yourself, there were not too many people that had equations, I think. What? Yeah, we're going to go through here. Let's say we start with Ralph. Somebody called up and said, I got a 2-foot diameter tree. And Ralph would say, 2 times 1.1 is 2.2. Ralph's going to say it's going to cost 4. Well, if you look at Ralph, it was 4 minus 3. So do you see Ralph underestimated by $100? This was 3 minus 4.1. And this one overestimated by $110. Everybody follow me? So we go through this, and I can write these numbers down very quickly here. Because do you see x is changing by 1? And the slope here is 1.1. So it's 3 plus 1.1 plus 1.1 plus 1.1. So then we've got 7 minus 5.2. You see that's a 1.8. 8 minus 6.3, 1.7. 8 minus 7.4, 0.6. So I've got 22.3, 4.1. The summation of E, I think, is 3 here. So I go 3, 7, 6. One up there is 8, 13. I think that's 27. You see, David would have gone 4, 5, 6, and 7. Anybody else can? Now, David's errors, y minus y hat, I'm not going to write it out. 4 minus 3, 1. 3 minus 4, minus 1. 7 minus 5, plus 2, plus 2, plus 1. We add this up, those cancel, summation E is 5. 13, 18, summation y hat is 25. I would have had 5, 6, 7, and 8. I look at my errors, and I have 0, minus 2, 1, 1, 0. My errors add up to 0. It's tough to be humble when you're good. When you're good at this shit, why do you want those two numbers to be the same? Put it into words. Yep. This is the total actual cost 4, 5, what? If you do regression, it does. Okay? Now notice what has to happen. The summation of E hat and the summation of y hat and the summation of E, these two numbers have to total this. So notice, David's model, 25 plus 5 is 30. Ralph's model, 27 plus 3 is 30. So where have you seen the fact that the errors add up to 0? And it depends on whether you've done assignment 5 yet. Where have you seen that summations will add up to 0? Yes, very good. So if I came back here and said, well, x was 3, 10, and 11, okay? And I add that up. We could look at and really say, what is x bar? It is an estimate of what we think it's at the averages, but see, we're trying to estimate what we think would be a good value that describes each of these. And if you remember when we did the x minus the x bar, it was 3 minus 8 is minus 5. 10 minus 8 is 2, and 11 minus 8 is 3. And there was a 100% guarantee that this will always add up to 0. And this is called an unbiased estimator of x. So this is what is called a necessary condition in modeling. If you come up and say, I have a model, the people who, well, I work in modeling, we would say to you, the first condition is it has to be unbiased. And stop and think about it this way. If I gave you this data pattern, would it make any sense to say, I'm going to put the line there? Now, do you see here, summation E will be greater than 0? I said that wrong. Will be less than 0. Because you've overestimated the cost every time. You follow me? Similarly, it doesn't make any sense to do this, to put it here. Because here you'd say, I'm biasing, I'm underestimating all my costs. And so from a logical standpoint, if we are trying to make predictions, logically, we need to position this such that the overestimates and the underestimates do what? They balance out. They will balance out. No. That's a good question, but we don't. And so what I'm trying to show here is years of practice. Well, that's a joke. That's a joke. We'll get to it. So let's say I go to Carl and I say, okay, Carl, you've got this background in accounting. You've kind of watched, didn't you, how I fit the line? And so Carl comes up and he says, yeah, this is pretty easy. Now, if you look at this, Carl says, what the hell are you laughing at? This is what I do for a business. I got to balance this shit over in the debits and the credit shit. It always balances out. So I know how to do that. I overestimated a little bit. Tough shit. I correct it. They cancel each other out. And this cancels out, and this cancels out. The fact that the errors add up to 0 is a necessary condition. I want you to understand this type of phraseology because it is used a lot in the modeling and by people who work with numbers. But it is not a sufficient condition to guarantee a good fit. I'm glad you all laugh. Sometimes people don't laugh. They're going to look and say, well, how the hell why did he go this way? An illogical model can have the errors add up to 0. So what's the problem? The problem is the lousy minus signs. That indicates that we overestimated. So we got to get rid of the minus signs so we have a sense of how much error there really is there. And if you looked at the descriptive statistics, there were 2 ways of doing this. You could come back and say, I'll use the absolute value, or I'll square it. Calculus doesn't work with absolute values. But what is it that we would say, I'd certainly like this number to be what? And if there's any error, it can't be 0. So the next best condition would be that it is a minimum. And what did we just talk about? Calculus gives us a ability to minimize and maximize. Now, the mathematics for this, you're somewhere in second or third year mathematics if you're going to really understand it. Okay? So Gauss comes along and he says, there's no guesswork to this. I use calculus. And using calculus, and I wouldn't write these down, using calculus, if you use my formulas, the way you get the slope and the way you get the y-intercept is a 100% guarantee. I will bet my life on this. There aren't that many things I'll bet my life on, but remember what we talked about with deductive reasoning. We proved the area of a circle was pi r squared, and what did we say? This will never be disproven. This was based on logical reasoning. This is what deductive reasoning in mathematics does. A 100% guarantee. The equation that you create, the errors will add up to 0, and summation E squared is a minimum. And this straight line is called the best fitting least squares line. The least squares is referring to it can't be any smaller. So this is why we looked at deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning gets used over and over and over again in creating theories. There is no guesswork. And it gets to be, we don't have the time to get into some of the elegance. It gets into be an incredibly elegant model. And I think part of it is it's so elegant and so interesting how he fit all this crap together that people get in love with it. The problem that you still have is by squaring these numbers, you see I get summation E squared equals 6. Mine is not the best fitting line. I played around with it to make the errors add up to 0. There are an infinite number of lines that will make it add up to 0. But the best fitting least squares line will beat that. If you can, what? Well, we're going to go through and do it. And we'll just simply say, what you have to believe is you can spend the rest of your life trying different lines. You will never find a line where the errors add up to 0 and the error squared is smaller than what we get. So I'm going to do this rather quickly because I want to talk about one other issue here. So if we look at x 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, y was 4, 3, 7, 8, 8. So I have to figure out x minus x bar. Okay? If you follow me, I need this. So I add up the x's. X bar is 3. So I have 1 minus 3, 2 minus 3, 3 minus 3, 4 minus 3, 5 minus 3. And as a check, there's this 100% guarantee that will add up to 0. I then need to do y minus y bar. So I add up the y's. That adds up to 30. So the average tree costs $600 to cut down. I have 4 minus 6, 3 minus 6, 7 minus 6, 8 minus 6, 8 minus 6. 100% guaranteed, that adds up to 0. But then it says I have to take x bar, x minus x bar times y minus y bar. So this times this gives me a plus 4, a plus 3, 0 times 1 is 0, 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4. So summation y minus, or x minus x bar times y minus y bar is equal to 13. So I'm halfway there to getting my slope, more than halfway. X minus x bar squared. I've got to take these numbers and square them. So I have 4, 1, 0, 1, 4. And so Gauss says the slope you want to use is 1.3. You get the y-intercept. You take y bar, which was 6. You just calculate it out. The slope was 1.3. The average of x was the 3, 2.1. So the best fitting least squares line is 1.3x plus 2.1. Okay. Now again, in real life, you're going to put the numbers on your spreadsheet. You never do it with just 5. I've done a very small number so we can talk about the mathematics here. And you push a button and what happens? The computer does all this crap for you. But do you see this crap here is the step 2? The rationalist, Gauss, looks at this and he says, hey, I can use the tool of calculus to guarantee that this will be a minimum. Every regression, whether you're using polynomial regression, you follow me, multiple regression, logarithmic regression, etc., the errors will always add up to 0 and the error squared is the minimum. You can spend the rest of your life trying to put a different line in. If you can beat what this line does, you bring down all of mathematics. The crown jewel in mathematics is calculus. They are proud as shit of this. This is the good stuff. And it's based on deductive reasoning, and deductive reasoning says it's never going to be disproved. Remember we've used that phrase? deductive reasoning has certainty to eternity. This is what captured people. They wanted everything to be perfectly deterministic. So remember here I got 6. And so if we come back and I use 1.3x plus 2.1, I put a 1 in here, where I say I get 3.4. And then it goes 4.7, 6.0, 7.3, 8.6. I add these up. Gee, they add up to 30. I do the errors, y minus y hat. 0.6 minus 1.7, 1, 0.7 minus 0.6, minus 1.7, 1 and 1.7, those cancel. Doggone it, errors add up to 0. I square these, 0.36, 289, 1.0, 0.49, 0.36. Tom's model was 6. You can't squeeze any more out of this. And the phrase is that you've positioned the model so it does the best job of explaining why the y value is varying. We'll talk about this later. Y hat, it turns out, is our estimate of the average cost. So we would estimate that trees that are 1 foot in diameter on an average will cost $340. 200 or 2 foot diameter tree on an average will cost 470. We got to talk about where do we get the standard deviation. Standard deviation will come from this. But we'll talk about that later. Somewhat okay up to here? Okay, so then there's one other number that you're going to look at. And this is the one that's often used. We come back and we say, is change in y over change in x positive, 0, or negative? Okay. Now we can answer that just by looking at the sign of the slope. But typically what is used is what is called the correlation coefficient. And it's the R value. This is if we've taken a sample and I wouldn't there is nothing intuitive about these formulas. You can sit and look at these until you die, and it's not going to make any sense why this stuff works. I mean, there is good logic, but it takes quite a bit of reasoning. So here's what the R value does. If every single point fell on a straight line, you see it would be a perfect linear. The R value will come out to be a +1. If you have a perfect straight line again, the R value will equal -1. If you have a fairly strong, you see things are clustered pretty close to the line. this might be a plus 0.8. If you had something like this, you see it isn't nearly as close to a straight line. This might come out to be minus 0.3. So the correlation coefficient measures how closely the data points fall on a straight line pattern. The R value has to be a value between -1 and +1. And so what you want to look at for something like this is that the R value only measures how closely the data pattern is to a straight line. And here's where you get into trouble. Now I could ask a question, can I fit a straight line to that? Yeah, I can do stupid things. There's no law against being stupid. So I could come back and say, I fit a straight line to it. You follow me? And so we need something along with the error squares to say, is this a linear pattern? And what would happen for this problem, R would come back and be very close to 0. And so this, when this happens, we say there is no, and you want to use the word linear. There is no linear relationship. Okay? There is no linear relationship because here's the problem. If I had something that looked like this, is there a pattern? Well, I'd say, yeah, I think there's a cyclic pattern here. There are certain things in sales that cycle, but if I go back and I fit a straight line to it, the R value will come out very close to 0. So for this particular problem, you need to do y minus y bar squared, which was 4, 9, 1. I'm just squaring these, 4 and 4. So what do I have? And so the R value is that equation up there. It's 13 divided by 10 times 22. It's 13 divided by the square root of 22. You see, if it was it's 220. If it was 225, it would be that would be 15. The square root of 225. And so this would come out to be 0.86. So it would say there is a reasonably strong linear relationship. Now what I think we talked a little bit, didn't we, about GPA and chance of being a success?
Oh, yeah, we know. We're holding on to that.
So now, if on the final, you don't catch this issue of correlations tell me nothing about causation. Nothing, 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 nothing. all a correlation does is it establishes that there is a linear relationship. We have to go to a different type of reasoning if we go to polynomial regression or other things. And so it is very easy, I think in the reading in the ghost map, it talked about confusing correlation with causation. Remember the elevation and so forth, and they say it's a very easy trap to fall into. And it was something that I know, I didn't figure that out until I got into grad school also. A lot of things figured out in grad school, where the undergrad you just didn't, you were doing too much memorizing.
You said that, so y minus y bar squared sum at 2.2 has a solid relationship, you said, or what was your
Oh, the R value here.
Yeah, the R value.
Now, the closer this gets to 1 or minus 1, the better the linear fit is. Because you see, if it's a plus 1, it's a perfect linear pattern. If it's a negative 1, it's a perfect, right, and the slope is negative. So if you look at this equation, this number, numerators are the same. So the sign has to be the same, because this number will always be a positive number, and this number will always be positive. Right. Anything off of +1 or -1 indicates the pattern is the points are not falling on a perfect straight line. And when they get totally away from a straight line, the R value gets close to 0. So it's one of the ways of saying, and we'll look at a problem in finance, and we'll see that correlation is used to create a diverse portfolio. So portfolio theory uses the R value. How do we reduce our risk? And we'll look at a problem on that. So try to at least get an intuitive feeling. What you have to look at in a lot of this is just to say, how they do this crap, I don't know. But these were brilliant people, and they did stuff that it works. Thanks for coming. See you in about 2 weeks, is it, or 3 weeks? That's coming up.